The number 666 has fascinated, disturbed, and provoked the most profound questions for centuries. Appearing in a mysterious passage of Revelation, shrouded in enigma, it has become a symbol of the greatest spiritual threat, the Antichrist. Who is he? Is he a historical figure, a spirit, an idea, or perhaps a coming force yet to be revealed? In a world filled with unrest, technology, manipulation, and the dominance of money, this question takes on new significance. This film does not offer a definitive answer. Instead, it invites viewers to take a closer look at the signs of the times and reflect on whether we may already be standing face to face with the reality the Bible described 2,000 years ago. The number 666 appears in the entire Bible only once, in chapter 13 of the book of Revelation, in the context of the description of the mysterious beast that rises from the sea and receives authority over the nations. In the book of Revelation we read, "Wisdom is needed here. One who understands can calculate the number of the beast, for it is a number that stands for a person. His number is 666. This number is clearly linked to the identity of the beast and is presented as the key to understanding it. Significantly, 666 appears nowhere else in the entire Holy Scripture, which gives this passage exceptional weight and mystery. For centuries, exegetes have sought to decipher its meaning, looking for both spiritual symbolism and specific historical references. The words, "It is the number of a person," spark much discussion among biblical scholars. Three main interpretations are most commonly accepted. The first, the most literal, suggests that the number 666 is the numerical letter value of a specific person's name. In the ancient world, people used the system of gematria, in which letters were assigned numerical values. The second interpretation reads, "the number of a person," as a symbol of human imperfection. In biblical symbolism, the number 7 signifies fullness, God's perfection, whereas 6 represents what is human and incomplete. A 666 would therefore point to the peak of human corruption, attempting to mimic divinity. The third view treats this phrase as a general reference to humanity itself. In this sense, the beast would be a product of human civilization detached from God. All these interpretations share one thing in common. The number 666, though rich in symbolism, remains inseparably connected with man, both his name and his nature. Recognizing the Antichrist solely on the basis of his number, 666, is difficult. However, the Book of Revelation and other New Testament writings provide a number of additional clues that may help identify the beast. Here are some passages from the Bible that give further information about it. "Then I saw a beast come out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads. On its horns were 10 diadems, and on its heads blasphemous names. I saw that one of its heads seemed to have been mortally wounded, but this mortal wound was healed. Fascinated, the whole world followed after the beast. To it, the dragon gave its own power and throne, along with great authority. Then I saw another beast come up out of the earth. It wielded all the authority of the first beast in its sight, and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast. It was also allowed to wage war against the holy ones and conquer them. It was granted authority over every tribe, people, tongue, and nation. It forced all the people, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, so that no one could buy or sell except one who had the mark of the beast or the number of its name. It was given a mouth uttering proud boasts and blasphemies, and it blasphemed God, his name, and his dwelling. Who is the liar? Whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. Whoever denies the Father and the Son, this is the Antichrist. Let no one deceive you in any way, for unless the apostasy comes first and the lawless one is revealed, the one doomed to perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God and object of worship, so as to seat himself in the temple of God, claiming that he is a god. Together, these clues create a coherent and compelling profile of the Antichrist as a figure, whether real or symbolic, who combines spiritual, political, and economic power, standing openly against God and his people. These passages evoke strong emotions and have, for centuries, been the subject of various interpretations. In this study, I will present the most important of them, without deciding which is true. Perhaps today we are not yet able to judge. It's possible that only the future will bring an answer that will seem obvious to many. It is also possible that none of the current theories is correct and that the proper explanation is yet to come. The order in which the interpretations are presented is random. The diversity of theories about the Antichrist stems primarily from the complexity of the biblical description, which contains both symbolic elements and those that can be read literally. The Book of Revelation, being a deeply figurative work, presents the Antichrist, the beast, through a series of traits and signs that open up wide possibilities for interpretation. This multi-layered meaning is well illustrated by comparing the biblical mark of the beast with the practice of wearing tefillin, Jewish phylacteries. Tefillin are two small leather boxes containing passages from the Torah, which devout Jews wear during morning prayer, one on the forehead and the other on the left arm, close to the heart. The command to wear them comes from the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Exodus, where God says that his words are to be a sign on your hand and a band between your eyes. This practice was well known even 2,000 years ago. Jesus himself mentions it in the Gospel, criticizing not its content, but the ostentation with which some Pharisees performed it. Against this background, the mark of the beast described in Revelation, also placed on the forehead and the hand, but on the right rather than the left, appears to be a deliberate inversion of the tefillin, a parody of God's covenant sign. Symbolically, this may mean that just as the tefillin express obedience to God and faithfulness to his commandments, so the mark of the beast indicates a spiritual allegiance to the Antichrist. Satan works deceitfully, not always through open hostility, but through the subtle distortion of what is good. Evil often disguises itself as truth, adopting a familiar form with one seemingly small change. As in this case, instead of the sign on the left hand, it is on the right. The difference may seem insignificant, but it leads to an entirely different end. And it is precisely in this slight alteration that the dangerous deception lies. Although some interpret the mark of the beast literally, as, for example, a physical tattoo, microchip, or biometric sign, awareness of the Jewish practice of wearing phylacteries suggests that a symbolic meaning is more likely. The author of Revelation was writing to an audience familiar with Jewish customs and symbols, so his readers would easily recognize that the mark on the forehead and hand is not merely a physical sign, but a sign of a spiritual choice, whether a person dedicates their thoughts and actions to God or to the beast. Let us now move on to presenting the various theories about the Antichrist himself. One of the more symbolic and spiritual interpretations of the number 666 assumes that it does not refer to a specific person or institution, but rather expresses the idea of complete separation from God and immersion in the purely physical, material dimension of existence. In Jewish tradition, the number 6 is associated with humanity and the material world. It was on the sixth day that God created man and completed the work of creating the visible reality. In the Bible, the threefold repetition of an element, as in holy, holy, holy in the book of Isaiah, signifies the highest degree of importance and fullness. Therefore, 666 can be read as a symbol of absolute physicality, elevated to the level of ultimate rejection of spirituality. In this view, the number 666 does not so much point to a specific Antichrist as to the condition of humanity immersed in materialism, cut off from God, and focused solely on satisfying physical needs. Such a life resembles the existence of animals, which do not reflect on questions of meaning, eternity, or salvation. They act solely on instinct, hunger, and impulse. This is precisely why, in Revelation, the mark of the beast serves only for buying and selling, participation in a world that reduces man to the role of consumer and producer. It is a world in which transcendence is excluded, and spirituality is deemed unnecessary. This idea is further reinforced by the scene of Jesus' temptation in the desert, where all of Satan's temptations concern earthly desires. Christ rejects each of them, showing that true humanity is not grounded in physicality, but in relationship with the Father and submission to His will. In this light, the number 666 becomes a symbol of a person who has abandoned God and become completely immersed in what is material and transient, losing sight of the meaning of existence and eternal destiny. One of the most frequently cited hypotheses interpreting the number 666 is the one that links it to Emperor Nero. The key element here is gematria, an ancient Jewish method of assigning numerical values to letters. In its classical form, the name Neron Kesar, written in Hebrew, adds up precisely to 666. Moreover, in some ancient manuscripts of Revelation, an alternative number, 616, appears, and this corresponds to the Latin form of the emperor's name, Nero Caesar. The existence of both numerical variants, adapted respectively to the Hebrew and Latin versions of Nero's name, is a strong argument suggesting that the author of Revelation had him specifically in mind. Supporters of this interpretation raise several additional points. First, the gematria fits, not only in terms of numerical value, but also within the cultural context in which such a method was known and used. Second, Nero was the object of the imperial cult. As a Roman emperor, he was worshipped as a god, which corresponds to the description of the Antichrist as one who takes his seat in the temple of God, claiming that he is a god. Third, it is worth noting that Revelation was written during a time of intense political tension. The author could have used a cipher to avoid persecution by the authorities. If he were writing about some future Antichrist, he could have done so openly, whereas the use of a cipher suggests he was referring to a contemporary, genuinely oppressive power. Opponents of this interpretation, however, point out several problems. First, gematria can be forced. It requires using the Hebrew spelling of a Latin name, which would not have been natural for all readers. Second, most scholars date the writing of Revelation to around 95 AD, several decades after Nero's death, which undermines the relevance of the reference. Third, John himself, in his first letter, observes that many antichrists have appeared already, which suggests he did not identify the figure with one specific person, but rather with a certain spirit of the age or system of power. The Neronic interpretation thus remains fascinating and well documented historically, but it does not exhaust the full richness of the symbolism of the number 666, perhaps deliberately, so that successive generations could also read it in the light of their own times. Another popular interpretation of the number 666 is the hypothesis that it refers not to a person living in the time of the author of Revelation, but to a future ruler who will only appear on the stage of history, the so-called eschatological Antichrist. This view is held by many evangelical and Protestant groups, as well as some contemporary Catholic and Orthodox exegetes. The theory rests on the assumption that Revelation deals largely with future events, especially those immediately preceding the second coming of Christ. Proponents of this approach point out that the beast of Revelation displays timeless traits, global scope of power, economic control no one can buy or sell except one who has the mark, self-worship, and direct conflict with God. In their view, no historical ruler, not even Nero, meets all these conditions at once, so the figure of the beast must still lie ahead of us. An additional argument is that Revelation contains many images that have not yet found a clear fulfillment in history, which suggests they're prophetic rather than purely historical character. Critics of this interpretation, however, raise important objections. First, Revelation was addressed to communities living in the 1st century. It would be strange if its main message concerned only a distant future, completely detached from the historical context of its first readers. Second, it is argued that the language of Revelation is symbolic rather than literal, and attempts to assign every number or figure to a specific future, political leader tend to be speculative and have often led to false predictions, as shown by various apocalyptic prophecies of the 20th century. Over the centuries, the number 666 has been linked to particular historical figures whose actions inspired fear, horror, or religious controversy. Already in early Christianity, apart from Nero, some identified the beast with other Roman emperors, such as Domitian, who also persecuted Christians. In the Middle Ages and during the Reformation, Protestants often regarded the Pope as the Antichrist, pointing to his wealth, claims of absolute authority, and assumed titles, for example, Vicar of Christ. Some even attempted to derive 666 from the title Vicarius Filii Dei, although such calculations are now considered questionable. In modern times, this line of thought has also been pursued by secular commentators. Napoleon Bonaparte, as the conqueror of Europe and adversary of the Church, was at times regarded as an embodiment of the beast. Similarly, Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, whose actions brought unimaginable suffering, mass persecution, and attempts to create a totalitarian system of rule without God. In the 20th century, some even tried to use gematria to derive 666 from the names of such figures, though such efforts usually require stretching the rules or manipulating language. Let us move on to the next interpretation. In the book of Revelation, chapter 13, the reader encounters the description of a mysterious beast rising from the sea. It has 10 horns and 7 heads. On its horns are diadems, and on its heads, blasphemous names. One of the beast's heads is mortally wounded, but the wound is healed, which fills humanity with wonder and leads them to worship it. The beast is granted authority over the whole earth, persecutes the holy ones, and introduces a mark without which no one can buy or sell. In chapter 17, the author identifies the 7 heads as 7 hills on which the woman sits and as 7 kings. Finally, he explains, "The woman whom you saw represents the great city that has sovereignty over the kings of the earth." In the interpretation that identifies the beast with the Roman Empire, nearly all of these symbols take on specific historical references. The beast rising from the sea symbolizes the political system of Rome, which came to dominate the Mediterranean world. The 7 heads are an obvious reference to the 7 hills of Rome, a detail hard to ignore when speaking of the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. The mortal wound of one of the heads refers to the dramatic crisis following the death of Emperor Nero in 68 AD, an event that shook the empire. In its aftermath came the so-called Year of the 4 Emperors, marked by violence, chaos, and uncertainty, something that can be read as the mortal wound of Rome. The healing of the wound corresponds to the period of stability and renewal of imperial power when Vespasian became emperor and initiated a long phase of consolidation. This picture fits perfectly into the political and religious context of the 1st century, in which Rome not only dominated militarily, but also demanded the imperial cult, worship of the emperor as a divine being, from its subjects. Christians who refused to worship the beast became victims of persecution. Even the mark of the beast can here be understood as a symbol of belonging to the imperial system, without which one could not fully participate in society and commerce. Despite the many parallels between the symbolism of Revelation and the reality of the Roman Empire, the theory that equates the beast with Rome also has its weak points, which are raised by both exegetes and theologians. Revelation contains elements that are clearly eschatological, that is, related to the future, especially to the end of time. It speaks of the second coming of Christ, the final judgment, and the complete destruction of the forces of evil. Identifying the beast solely with historical Rome may therefore narrow the message of Revelation, which, many believe, also had a universal and prophetic dimension. After all, the beast is said to have authority over every tribe, people, tongue, and nation, and that scope goes beyond even the reach of the mighty Roman Empire. On the other hand, for the author of Revelation, the Roman Empire might well have appeared to be a power encompassing the entire known world at the time. Some scholars point out that not all elements of the beast's description fit Rome. For example, the mark on the forehead or right hand, which determines the ability to trade, has no clear historical equivalent in Roman practices. While it can be understood symbolically as submission to the system, there is no evidence of an actual sign that allowed or forbade buying and selling. There is also a controversial hypothesis claiming that the Antichrist would be Jesus himself. However, this assertion is entirely contrary to the message of sacred scripture, which clearly distinguishes Christ as the Son of God from the Antichrist as his adversary. The most unequivocal response to this claim is given by St. John in his first letter. "Who is the liar? Whoever denies that Jesus is the Christ. Whoever denies the Father and the Son, this is the Antichrist." Another important interpretation presents the Antichrist not as a specific person or institution, but as a spirit or idea that manifests itself in different people, eras, and systems, always whenever there is opposition to God and his revelation. This concept is supported by St. John himself, who writes, "And every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus does not belong to God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist that you heard was to come, but in fact is already in the world." Supporters of this interpretation emphasize that the Antichrist is, above all, a spiritual stance, whether systemic or individual, that rejects God, truth, and love, leading to enslavement, falsehood, and the persecution of believers. It does not have to take a single form. It can manifest itself in propaganda, false ideologies, cults of personality, or totalitarian systems. The advantage of this approach is its universality. It explains why the spirit of the Antichrist was already present in the time of St. John, but can also manifest in the future. Critics of this theory point out that the book of Revelation describes the beast in very concrete terms, as a being with personal characteristics, receiving authority, performing signs, accepting worship, and having an assistant, the false prophet. In their view, it is difficult to reconcile such realistic and dynamic descriptions with a purely spiritual or symbolic understanding. Furthermore, Scripture also speaks of the coming of a single Antichrist who will play a specific role in the end times, which suggests that this is not merely an abstract spirit of opposition, but a real figure. Despite these objections, the concept of the Antichrist as a spirit remains relevant and speaks strongly to the conscience, especially in times when the systemic rejection of truth, morality, and faith seems to be taking on new, widely accepted forms. Among the more controversial hypotheses about the identity of the Antichrist is the theory that it refers to Muhammad, the founder of Islam. Supporters of this idea point out that in the Greek original of Revelation, the number 666 was written as chi stigma. Some suggest that the author of Revelation may not have seen a number at all, but rather graphic symbols that were later misinterpreted as numerals. In their view, this inscription could resemble Arabic symbols, such as crossed swords and the calligraphic phrase Bismillah, in the name of Allah, which indeed often appears in Islamic emblems and flags. From this perspective, the beast and its mark would symbolize Islam as a religious political system. Proponents of this theory raise several arguments. First, the number 666 would refer to one specific historical figure, which fits the biblical pattern of identifying the Antichrist. Second, Islam has historically persecuted Christians, which corresponds to the description of the beast that will make war against the holy ones and conquer them. Third, Islam introduced a system that, from the Christian point of view, denied the divinity of Christ. Additionally, a mark on the hand or forehead is indeed worn by some Islamists. However, this theory also has serious weaknesses. First of all, Revelation clearly encourages, "Let the one with understanding calculate the number of the beast." If the author invites readers to calculate the number, this implies that it refers to an actual numerical value, not merely the shape of letters resembling Arabic symbols. Otherwise, the instruction to calculate would make no sense. Second, Muhammad never claimed divine status, whereas the Antichrist is said to seat himself in the temple of God, claiming that he is a god. Third, Islam as a religion forbids the worship of humans, which contradicts the biblical description of the beast, to whom worship was given. Additionally, Islam recognizes Jesus as a prophet, though not as the Son of God, so it cannot be said to be a complete rejection of Christ. In summary, while this hypothesis intrigues some researchers and commentators, most contemporary exegetes regard it as weak and strained, mainly because it conflicts with the key biblical characteristics of the Antichrist and represents an ahistorical reading of the text of Revelation. One of the more symbolic and at the same time critical of modernity hypotheses is the one that identifies the Antichrist with money, or more broadly, with the global financial system that subjugates individuals, nations, and institutions. The arguments for this interpretation are numerous and often touch on deeply social and spiritual issues. First, Revelation speaks of the mark of the beast, without which no one can buy or sell, something many read as a reference to the financial system which determines who can participate in economic life. The lack of the proper mark, for example, a bank account, digital identity, or creditworthiness, already today means exclusion. Second, in many societies, the worship of money has displaced the worship of God. Mammon becomes the new absolute, and people are measured by their market value, productivity, and purchasing power. A third argument is the symbolic reading of the vision of the beast's 7 heads. This could refer to the G7, the group of the world's 7 most economically powerful nations. Furthermore, the beast came up out of the sea, and in modern times, the Anglo-Saxon nations are often called people of the sea, as they dominate the world's maritime trade routes. As is well known, the Anglo-Saxons are the architects of the current financial system. Against this theory is the fact that Revelation describes the beast as a being acting consciously, possessing personality, authority, and making blasphemous claims against God. Money itself is not a being. It is a tool that can be used for both good and evil. The Bible does not condemn money itself, but rather the love of money and placing it above God. Moreover, in Revelation, the mark of the beast is not just a condition for trade, but also a sign of spiritual allegiance and worship, something that implies a more conscious devotion than mere participation in an economy. Despite these reservations, this interpretation accurately diagnoses the spiritual trap of the modern world, in which money has become not only a means, but an end in itself. And for many people, it truly functions as a god, determining their values, fears, and identity. It is hard not to notice that it is precisely through economics and financial dependency that the world could, in the future, most easily be brought under a single authority. Whether this would take the form of the Antichrist remains an open question.